Thank you very much for joining me today. I have a background of 28 years as Deputy Keeper at the V&A in the Department of Sculpture, Metalwork, Ceramics and Glass. So today I'm sharing with you my curated highlights for glass, ceramics and sculpture. Could we have the first slide, please? I was excited to see this pair of Vases wall lights in Ronald Phillips's display for Masterpiece 2020 because I recognize them from a bill submitted by the Huguenot cabinet maker and looking glass seller Philip Arbuthnot to the Lord Chamberlain's department. He supplied a pair of double branch gilded sconces, diamond cut and engraved, embellished with crimson and gold mosaic work for the Queen to present to the Emperor of Morocco in 1703-4. The technique vers églamisé is anachronistic. It is named after the Paris dealer Jean-Baptiste Glomy, who was born 5 years after these sconces were made. In the early 18th century, this technique was very fashionable at the courts of Paris, Dresden, and London. And in Germany, it was referred to as a border of marquetry work, thus imitating the subtlety of the contrasting techniques engaged with by the likes of André Charles Boulle in Paris. We have the next slide, please. As you walk into and closer to these objects, you can see that the uppermost section is decorated from behind with the application of gold leaf that's been engraved with the red lacquer paint superimposed, inspired by pattern books such as that published in 1688 by Stalker and Parker, a treatise of Japanning. The lowest section behind the brass nozzles is decorated with flowers. So the sconces, to my mind, represent the four elements: the air above, the earth below, water represented in the pool reflected the architecture behind the figures, and then you light the candles and you have fire. Next slide, please. Just to remind you that the treatise of Japanning and varnishing was published in Oxford in 1688. It encouraged ladies to take Japanning as extras at school and to engage with this fascination with all things from Asia imported through the East India Company. So we know that Philip Arbuthnot, based in the Strand, was supplying lacquer furniture, its English imitation, and a specialist in supplying looking glass goods. Some of the furniture he supplied to Lady Betty Germain can be seen today at Drayton House in Northamptonshire. Next, please. Just to leave you with this vision of Cathay, the combination of pagodas, silhouetted trees, and chinoiserie-looking figures, ingredients that you would have found on contemporary tapestries and furniture. And the colourway would have been selected in order to enhance the interior of a particular room. So imagine these sconces in the context of the great Melville State bed at the V&A, where the rich crimson colour of the bed hangings would have been enhanced by that same colour in the supporting furniture. Next, please. Well, after 3 months of extraordinary, unprecedented lockdown, it seemed appropriate to focus on some of the themes that have enlivened our existence. And I turned to the world of nature, and particularly to birdsong, And I share with you today these beautiful gold finches that were made at Chelsea Porcelain. And of course, Chelsea is the usual location for Masterpiece, and Trust will be again in 2021. These beautiful birds were made under the authority of Nicholas Spremore, an émigré goldsmith, recorded in London in 1742. He came originally from Liège, and we've recently discovered that he was definitely in Paris in 1736. By the mid-1740s, he had acquired property in Chelsea and was making a whole range of products, table services, but particularly ornaments. And in this, he was inspired by the work of George Edwards, a contemporary who published A Natural History of Uncommon Birds and some other rare and undescribed animals. His volumes appeared between 1743 and 1751, and they were dedicated to Sir Hans Sloane and, appropriately, to God. Just notice the striking red crown, golden beak, bright yellow wings. And these were evidently modelled from the life, because George Edwards doesn't illustrate this very common garden bird, which apparently has become even more common in the last 6 years. It has a delightful, liquid, twittering song and call, and it migrates in the winter to Spain, France, and Belgium. So if you're in any of those countries, look out for this enchanting bird. Next slide, please. So this is the title page of George Edwards' publication. You can see that he was library keeper in the Royal College of Physicians. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. And I was fascinated to discover that print of Indian rollers that I had inherited from my grandmother could form a partnership with this beautiful pair of Berlin porcelain rollers in Masterpiece 2020 with dealer Michel Bini. They have later ormolu mounts dating from the 19th century, but they demonstrate again the extraordinary way in that decoration could match nature. Produced at the Berlin factory in the early years, 1765. The factory was actually founded in 1763 by Frederick the Great. And I wonder whether the decorators had access to George Edwards' recent publication. Next slide, please. Also associated with Chelsea through the manager, Charles Goon. The figure on the left seemed appropriate for lockdown because he is masked, perhaps not to government approval because the mask doesn't cover his mouth. This, of course, is Harlequin from the Commedia dell'arte. It's actually an exquisite little scent bottle made by the St. James's factory in Piccadilly. Charles Goon, the proprietor, was another immigré, a Huguenot from Dieppe. He had worked with Nicholas Spremore at the Chelsea factory in the 1740s, but went his own way and established a new manufactory in Piccadilly. These exquisite little toys, as they were known, the scent bottle is just 8.3 centimeters high, were obviously cherished gifts to a loved one. But of course, the figure of Harlequin conjures up that very popular entertainment which might be seen at street fairs or might be seen at court or in court theatres. And on the right, I juxtapose Harlequin with his companion, Columbine, from another scent bottle which is in the collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I would recommend those of you who are intrigued by these little figures to read Meredith Chilton's extraordinary account of the Harlequin Unmasked, the Commedia dell'arte and porcelain sculpture, which accompany an exhibition at the Gardner Museum in Toronto. I would also remind you that the role of Harlequin represented the most famous actor, David Garrick's first appearance on the London stage at the Goodman Fields Theatre in 1740. These little figures are set against a wonderful contemporary print, and I think the way in which the hand-coloured print complements the colours of these little scent bottles from the St James's factory is remarkable. The print dates from 1760, was sold by John Bowles. Next slide, please. Well, we're moving ahead to the early 19th century, to these really elegant mounted fuso vases. They are a combination of porcelain imitating tortoiseshell, mounted with ormolu. Again, a combination of materials associated with Charles Boulle and his imitators. They were made at the Dille and Gerard factory in Paris, which was started under the protection of the Duke d'Angoulême in rivalry to Sèvres. In fact, a very similar vase appears in a contemporary portrait of one of the proprietors, Christopher Dille, the chemist, the scientist, which was painted on porcelain in 1797. You can see that portrait on the dealer's website. The exquisite ormolu mounts on the neck of acanthus and antimon were provided by Pierre-Philippe Thomier. He trained as a sculptor and in the workshop of the renowned Pierre Gautier, and he worked with J.C.T. Duplessis, the artistic director of the Sèvres porcelain factory. But he specialized as a bronzier, providing mounts for porcelain, for clocks and for furniture. He managed to flourish despite the end of the Napoleonic era. First of all, as ciseleur de l'Empereur, and then fournisseur de leur Majesté, as Napoleon assumed regal status, and then carried on beyond the Napoleonic era as a marchand mercier, selling his own productions. And a long life, he died in his 90s in 1843. We could move to the next slide, please. Well, I'm delighted to share with you this remarkable pair of patinated plaster busts simulating bronze of two literary contemporaries, Matthew Pryor on the left and William Congreve on the right. If you're familiar with the monuments in Westminster Abbey, you will find that both are commemorated. Congreve with a profile bust by the sculptor Francis Bird, and Pryor with a wonderful French bust by the French sculptor Quasivaux. Richard Parker, who supplied these two busts, and they are actually signed on the reverse, worked in the Strand, and he was visited by Josiah Wedgwood's London agent, William Cox, who asked Parker to cast off medallion portraits for reproduction at the Wedgwood factory. The detail on these plaster busts is really remarkable, capturing contemporary dress. Though they date from 1770, they present a very lively Rococo rendering of the two subjects, dressed in a sort of traditional soft cap, which was associated with creative individuals. Such busts would have been supplied by Parker to decorate interiors. They could have been displayed in libraries to distinguish different bookcases, or because these two form such a handsome pair, perhaps they were intended for an overmantel in a hall or a drawing room. Richard Parker was the second generation. His father had also supplied Wedgwood with models of Shakespeare and mythological subjects. And the importance of suppliers of plaster models in the 18th century cannot be overemphasized. It provides an important link between ceramics and sculpture in this period. And we could go on, please, to the next slide. Those are detail of the bust, and if you zoom in on the dealer's website, you'll be able to make out the signature, R. Parker. So my next highlight is a set of 3 good vases by Andrew Wicks, who trained at Leicester, Brighton, and the Royal College of Art. And Andrew is inspired by natural forms and shapes. And what intrigues me about these vases is they remind me of ivory turnings, and particularly fine examples in the Dresden museums. Ivory turning was a very skilled and sophisticated hobby, particularly at princely courts in Baroque times. But ivory obviously brings many difficult circumstances with it today. It's not accessible as a material. And I feel these beautifully thrown and then hand-carved pots provide a wonderfully timeless alternative to ivory forms. I'm intrigued by Andrew's work because he has also made for commercial design. Look for his pod beaker for Hotel Chocolat, which is available commercially online. And I'm also intrigued by the way in which he marks his work, not just with a monograph signature, but also using a date letter. I'm not sure quite what his date letter is for 2019, but his website shows the range of impressions that are made on his earlier work. And of course, this also fits with historic ceramics. So I commend Andrew's work to you. The next slide, please. And on to our triumphant last subject, the great poet George Lord Byron, who was actually very resistant and critical of the sculptured portraits that were made during his lifetime. He was in Italy in the period 1817 to 1822, and in Rome in 1817 he sat to the Danish sculptor Thorvaldsen for his bust. The sculptor reported to his friend Hans Christian Andersen, "Byron placed himself opposite me, but at once he began to put on a quite different expression from that usual to him. 'Will you not sit still?' said I. 'You need not assume that look.' 'That is my expression,' said Byron. 'Indeed,' said I, and then I represented him as he wished. When the bust was finished, it was universally admitted to be an excellent likeness. Byron, when he saw the bust, said, 'It's not at all like me. My expression is more unhappy.' In 1822, Byron sat to another Italian sculptor, Bartolini. Again, Byron was not pleased. He thought that he looked like a superannuated Jesuit, and that it was dreadful, though my mind misgives me that it is hideously like. If it is, I cannot be long for this world, for it overlooks 70. Well, predictably, Byron, 2 years later, was to die at Missolonghi in support of Greek independence. So Masterpiece 2020 provides a remarkable opportunity to acquire a bust by the little-known Italian sculptor and portrait painter Ottaviano Giovanazzi, who was active between 1820 and 1848. He trained at the Accademia di Belle Arti in Florence. It's probable that he modelled this bust of Byron in Pisa in 1822, although it's signed and dated 1840. But it represents a remarkable opportunity to capture this extraordinary character. Somehow, I think in the early 21st century, there is an intense cultural interest in the individuality of self, the pattern of celebrity, and who best to capture that than George Lord Byron. So I'd like to end with the last slide, please, which is Thorwaldsen's bust of Lord Byron in the Royal Collections, which was given by the daughter of Byron's great friend, Cam Hobhouse, to King George V in the 19-teens. Thank you for joining me today. I am very glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Tessa. We have a few questions. The first one is, given the fragile nature of porcelain, china and glass, how vital is it to have a piece in perfect condition, especially for pieces that are hundreds of years old, for both collectors and museum collections? Or is it the provenance and type of piece that truly matters?
That's a very interesting question, and given the museum that I've been associated with had some 29,000 items of ceramic, which we had to move in order to redo the ceramic galleries some 10 years ago. I am very conscious of the challenges presented by repaired ceramics. And indeed, I think the Berlin porcelain birds have got some modest repairs. But I would say in both instances, the examples I've shown are rare, and these present unique opportunities to acquire a model that may be particularly appropriate for our times. And I would say that it is the rarity and opportunity to acquire that need to be balanced with the condition of the object. And obviously it depends how well the conservation has been undertaken. But sometimes if the conservation is historic, that can add interest to the piece under consideration, because in the past we have attempted to document the history of conserving ceramics.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And the next question. We are getting used to seeing paintings online, but I find looking at 3D objects harder. Given that we can't handle them at the moment, do you have any tips for what to look for or what questions to ask?
Yes, I think that if you are interested in acquiring an object, for example, from Masterpiece, that it is well worth talking to the dealer, as indeed I spoke to Edward Hearst today about the bust of Congreve and Pryor, because I wanted to understand exactly how they are signed and the quality of the patination. So obviously the dealer will be promoting their wares, but of course you can always ask for detailed photographs if you're really engaging with the opportunity to acquire. And you can also ask for a condition report. And you know, from the museum perspective, we would always have a condition report before acquiring.
Great, thank you so much. The next question. These are the most beautiful historic pieces. Was there anything contemporary that caught your eye?
Well, in researching the Ver-Aglamise sconces, I was reminded that the technique is still practiced today by Francis Binnington, I think also goes under the name of Francis Federer. And if you look on the V&A website, you will see that the V&A actually acquired an example of her work about 15 years ago. I think it's a sort of picture in Vergler Musée entitled Annie, Get Your Gun. Go look it out.
Thank you. And the next question is from David Oakey, who says, thank you, Tessa, for this enriching insight. The sconces for the King of Morocco are astonishing. I was wondering how rare Vert Eglamise on a red ground was at this stage.
Very interesting. There are other examples, and particularly springs to mind a remarkable looking glass that was made for General Charles Churchill, brother to the great first Duke of Marlborough, which is in a private collection, which, as you're a member of the Furniture History Society, you may know that members of the FHS saw in May last year.
Thank you very much. The next one, what is the difference between reversible repair and conservative repair?
Gosh, that's quite a technical question, isn't it? I think we probably need a conservator to answer it, but museum conservation always recommends that treatment is reversible. So if you are buying using museum ethics, I would suggest that you ask the dealer if a piece has been repaired, if the repair is reversible.
Thank you very much. And the next question is about the two vases. Did they specialise in this type of trompe-l'oeil glazes? What does it represent? Ornamental stone? And was there a fashion for these at the time?
So the pattern on the vases represents tortoiseshell, hence the parallel with Boule's work. But they also produced vases imitating hardstone. So quite a range, I think, but it also is characteristic of the skill involved in reproducing other materials. I think there was a fascination with that facility. Scagliola is another such example, producing different marbles using a different, although related, technique.
Thank you. And the next question is about the Edward Hearst busts. As simulated bronze, was this because they were therefore more affordable, or is it because they were for a wider market?
I think the answer is both. And Parker was just one of a number of suppliers. Perhaps the best known is John Cheer, who was supplying large groups of busts, particularly for gentlemen's, and I should say ladies' libraries.
Thank you. And I'll just do two more. There are so many, I don't think we'll have time to get through them all. But the last two. So Gautier, did he work for the Marchand or for the porcelain manufacturers?
Well, there's been much recent research on Gautier, wonderful exhibition that was shown at the Frick and at the Wallace collection. And so I would refer you to the publication for that exhibition for a proper response to your question.
Thank you. And then the final question is about the Byron's bust. This is a posthumous bust. What might have provoked its making?
Well, there was a huge following for Byron, I think possibly accentuated by his tragic and premature death. But I don't know if the questioner has read any of Byron's works. If not, I would recommend that you pick up Don Juan. His poetry is incredibly lively and engaging, and the romantic drama of his existence attracted attention in the same way that we are fascinated by some contemporary celebrities. So I think that explains the market for a posthumous bust.